The 19th century saw several attempts at powered flight. In fact, in 1848, one John Stringfellow of Chard in Somerset made a successful attempt with a model aeroplane powered by steam. It flew, aided by wires, the entire length of his workshop, but it wasn't a manned flight. As the world woke up to the 20th century, the only way to get someone safely off the ground was with hydrogen-filled balloons. This had obvious advantages in the Boer War.
The British military basically thought that if they could look over the horizon, if they could look over the next hill, they'd have the advantage on the enemy.
Because the observers were in the balloons, they could get the artillery fire quite close to the front of the British troops, or keep the fire going on the Boer right up until the time that the British troops actually got to their trenches, to their positions.
Balloon observation was obviously going to be useful. The army decided to develop it further.
And what they did was, at Farnborough, chosen because of its location, its proximity to London, the fact that there was ground available, and it was close to Aldershot, the home of the British Army, they created a balloon school and the balloon experimental works. In other words, if you like, they actually created a centre of excellence, although they probably wouldn't have called it that in those days.
But Britain was lagging behind. In America, the Wright brothers had already flown a powered man-carrying flying machine in December 1903. Things needed to move on. The balloon school, which opened in 1906, gathered together a mixed bunch of pioneers. One of these men had arrived from the USA in 1890. He was Samuel Franklin Cody and had been touring Britain with a Wild West show. To some, he was a little eccentric.
He was a fascinating character. Long hair, goatee beard, Stetson hat, long frock coats in the later days, but in the early days he had his cowboy gear on, his leather jackets and trousers, great big cowboy boots, and he was quite a character.
Cody had been hired by the army to develop a man-lifting kite which would replace the costly gas-filled balloons.
He thought if you could build a kite big enough, then you might be able to get in it, and with a possibly bit of wing warping, which was unheard of in those days, he thought he could get in one and fly them.
Other developments were taking place at Farnborough. A powered dirigible, which would enable observers to move around the sky, was about to take to the air. Cody took a personal interest. It was called the Nulli Secundus.
It set off to demonstrate to the population in London, to get the imagination of presumably the Times and the government at the same time. What you had to do if you were a designer, somebody like Cody, is that you had to actually convince the powers that be they were based in London.
They'd never seen anything like it before. This huge sausage-shaped thing making a roaring noise throughout the skies. There was nothing like it.
Well, everything went well, but like everything in aviation, you're always dependent on the weather. And by the time they got to the Crystal Palace area, they had to put down, and they had to go down, really, because they had no alternative. The weather was just going to be too bad. So, ignominy, really, because the airship had to then be dismantled and taken back by road to Farnborough. It never flew again.
Ever resourceful, Cody set about seeing what could be achieved if a kite could be adapted to take an engine. Early experiments were successful.
He had obtained a grant from the War Office of £50 to build British Army Aeroplane No. 1. They took the engine out of the airship and he installed it into his aircraft. He did a series of hops and leaps along Laffin's Plain and eventually got into the air.
This was in October, 16th of October 1908, when Cody took the aircraft into the air for the first time. The aircraft did signify to open-minded people in the military that this was something that would be actually better than balloons, better than airships, that the fixed-wing aeroplane was here to stay.
Just 9 months after Cody's first 27-second flight, Louis Blériot took off and crossed the English Channel in a monoplane of his own design. The Daily Mail had sent a young and very enthusiastic reporter to Dover. He could hardly contain himself.
Yes, there it was on the ground. There in front of us, on a downward tip of grass, lay the most wonderful thing in the world today. And there too was the man. Monsieur Blériot stood by his machine. His face was shining with perspiration, but he seemed as calm as if he had gotten out of a hansom cab. He was smiling. There was happiness and triumph in his keen dark eyes.
Aviation, it seemed, had captured people's imagination. But not everyone was as devoted. Even the ever-enthusiastic Daily Mail had to give space to those who were not quite so keen on this new form of transport.
A number of gentlemen have certainly constructed machines which will fly, and I'm not concerned to deny the mechanical triumph. But what purpose are these wonderful machines to serve? To what use are they to be put? They've provided a sensation for spectators, just as football players do. The aeroplane, in fact, is a toy, and I'm not sure it will ever be anything else. The air is too unstable, the sustaining power that overcomes the force of gravity too precarious for the element of danger ever to be eliminated or reduced to the inconsiderable proportion that human prudence will always demand.
One man who witnessed Blériot's arrival in Dover was a young Army Lieutenant, Herbert Musgrave. Realizing the implications of the Channel crossing, he headed for the War Office. If a man can cross the Channel by air, he thought, then so could an invading army. Sir William Nicholson, Chief of General Staff, told him that aviation was a useless and expensive fad advocated by a few individuals whose ideas were unworthy of attention. Musgrave was shown the door. The military went one step further. They stopped aircraft production at Farnborough and sacked Cody, along with the other aviation pioneers.
Well, those in Whitehall, in the corridors of power, may well have decided that fixed-wing aviation wasn't for the British military. But luckily there were other people around, both private entrepreneurs and individual army officers, who could see the benefits that were going to be there. And of course you had to come to Salisbury Plain for anything which is experimental in the army of those days. This huge area here in Wiltshire where everything that was developed in that immediate pre-First World War period was being put through its paces. There was the creation at Lark Hill of the School of Artillery, a new and very significant series of buildings. First of all, the Bristol Flying School, where people were learning to fly. And then a hangar next door, shortly afterwards, was created the British and Colonial Aeroplane Company.
It began, Sir George White used to go to south of France for his holidays, and he saw one of Blériot's aeroplanes flying round, and he said, we must have one of those. Because, you know, he lived in Bristol and was one of the great people of Bristol. He started here as a boy, and he then brought up all the horse trams and converted them to electricity, and was a very keen person on transport. And he set up the British and Colonial, as it started off to be. He set it up initially at Lark Hill, but it came back to Bristol at Filton, which was the end of one of his tram lines.
Bristol is one of the three cradles of aviation in Britain, the other two being Farnborough and Brooklands. And because of that, Filton has got a very special relationship within the aerospace business in the UK. Hence, the airfield here at Filton is important to me, and I've landed here from time to time over the years, and naturally felt that it was part of that great heritage of aviation, particularly here in the southwest.
The first aeroplane to emerge from the Bristol factory was the box kite, but it still took 2 years of development by companies like them to change the Army's mind.
The Imperial General Staff had a road to Damascus-style conversion. Having said that fixed-wing aviation really wasn't going to work, that the battlefield didn't need aviation, they saw with horror, I think, probably, what was happening in Germany and France. The continental rivals developing aviation over the battlefield. And as a result of that, what they decided to do was to create an air battalion. They swallowed their words, but they asked for volunteers, and they got people involved there who were 11 pilots who'd paid for their own flying, enthusiasts, people like Major Herbert Musgrave, who'd seen Blériot's first landing. But by 1912 it was obvious it had to be part of the army structure properly. They created the Royal Flying Corps, but like all new things in the army, if you were going to join, you had to be an enthusiast, because it was going to blight your military career. So they started the preparation for creating this aviation capability, not only in the Army, but also in the Royal Naval Air Service. Aircraft to protect the ships at sea, to carry out reconnaissance operations. Both of them started quite a hectic flying training program. The equipment, the BE-2 aircraft, Perhaps today we'd look at it and wonder how anyone could possibly go into the air. But they did, and they started to put the foundations down so that by 1914 they could deploy aircraft to the Western Front.
What about the Rug and Gust?
Nah.
Have you tried it?
Nah.
I wasn't looking forward to coming, but when I did get here, I found out how good it really was.
Mind-blowing.
I was very impressed.
It was magical.
Nobody should miss it.
If you've got a mind of your own, take it to the Dome. With Price Check 2000, Summerfield's fresh beef frying steak is half price.
Have you noticed how things taste even better when there's money off?
They entered a land of enchantment where nothing was quite as it seemed. This surely was a place for fun, propelling them into the unexpected. Sheer excitement at every turn. A place to unwind, a place to go wherever their imagination will take them. They journeyed over water, through past lands, through traditions, watched by wondrous creatures. A magical place, a thrill of a lifetime. Paulson's Park, Exit 2, M27. It's a hoot.
Well, how did it go?
They said there was too many grey areas.
Perhaps they've got a point.
Grey areas? I can fix that.
Just for Men takes off the years Grey puts on for a natural look in just 5 minutes.
Great presentation.
Now that's what I call using your head.
Just for Men takes off the years Grey puts on. And for the hard-to-colour hair in beards and moustaches, use Just for Men gel.
It took the Army, still living in the age of the horse, several years to accept that aviation was here to stay. The Navy, although cautious, was better equipped to take it more seriously.
Naval dockyards in the 19th century were amongst the most advanced technological complexes in the world. The Navy was well used by 1912 to dealing with machinery, to dealing with contractors who made that machinery and who produced the best results. Admiralty interest in aeroplanes always grew as the aeroplane became practical. In other words, sailors did with aeroplanes what they had always done with ships, when the aeroplanes could do it better.
One small problem was that ships didn't have runways. Aeroplanes had to be winched on and off the deck. The Navy therefore had to be creative.
A wooden ramp was built over the forecastle of HMS Africa, and Lieutenant Sampson, one of the first 4 naval officers to be taught to fly, took off from that ramp in a harbour.
They could get an aeroplane off the ship, but the Navy still had to solve the problem of getting it back on again. However, the overall success of these experiments led the Admiralty to adopt aeroplanes as part of the fleet. These machines, though, were still little more than wood, canvas and string, and although designs had improved, their safety record was terrible.
Nobody really took that into consideration. The pilot was there to steer the aeroplane, and any thought of giving him protection really didn't enter into designers' minds, mainly, I think, because those designers usually were the pilots themselves. So we had a period just before the First World War of losing some of the best and the brightest in British aviation.
Charles Roll, as the first man to fly the English Channel both ways, was Britain's first air casualty at Bournemouth in 1910. Samuel Cody was there when he crashed.
He ran over to his aircraft that was absolutely smashed on the floor and picked Charles Roll's body off out the ground. And the crowds at the time and people were so amazed that a grown man of Cody's stature as well could have great big tears running down his face.
Then, in August 1913, Samuel Cody himself was killed when an aeroplane he was testing broke up in the air.
He was going to take his son Leon up, but a chap called W.H.B. Evans, who was the Hampshire cricket captain, asked to be taken up, and Cody said, "I'll take him up first. He seems like a good sport. I'll give him a frightening of his life, you know." And literally, unfortunately to their dismay, they've both perished.
The flamboyant pioneer of British aviation, who 4 years before had been fired by the army, was given a hero's send-off.
There were over 50,000 people that lined the funeral procession from his house in Ash Vale to the military cemetery in Aldershot, where he was buried. He had a full gun carriage send-off, and it was a wonderful sight, absolutely wonderful.
On Salisbury Plain itself, some bizarre ideas were being considered to improve safety.
One of the nicest stories which has come out of the early days of flying, particularly in the British military, is the fact that at Lark Hill, so close to the ancient monument of Stonehenge, the landing strip there was considered to be probably blemished by the matter of the stones at Stonehenge. That, quite frankly, the British Army felt, so the story goes, that if they flattened those stones, if they took away Stonehenge and perhaps re-erected it somewhere else, they'd have a very clear landing strip. There'd be no turbulence on the approach or on takeoff. Today, it just doesn't bear thinking about.
When war broke out in 1914, Britain only had 110 aircraft against Germany's 246. The lack of official interest in aviation between 1909 and 1911 also meant that British aeroplanes couldn't compare with the superior German machines.
Those of us born in the latter part of the century, of course, can't know what it was like to fly over the Western Front, but it must have been pretty hair-raising. Young pilots, 18, 19, 20 years old, with very little flying experience, were sent to the Western Front, straight onto aircraft, straight into combat. And I can remember the first time I flew an open cockpit biplane, and having to keep it in the air, to worry about navigation. The thought suddenly struck me that when my great-uncle had been doing this in 1917 and 1918, people had been trying to kill him as well. And you suddenly get this feeling you must look behind you in case there's the proverbial Hun in the sun.
Many years have passed since those fragile aeroplanes, piloted by brave and somewhat foolhardy men, crossed over to France. But there are still a few who live to tell the tale. After a few weeks of basic training in 1917, Philip Bristow was sent to Vendôme in northern France to learn to fly. His first aeroplane was a Caudron, known at the time as the flying bathtub.
My instructor was a young sub-lieutenant. I think yes, I remember his name. It was Sams. So Mr. Sams took me in hand. So when the time was ripe, we were out there at the airfield with the engine ticking over, and Sams then put his hand on the control, and I put my hand on it, and I felt it push the throttle forward. The engine came into full life and roared away, and we started to move across the grass. He said to me, "Now, feel the controls. Don't push them, but just feel what I do." And I did. With my right hand, I held the joystick and my 2 feet on the rudder bar, and we got faster and faster, and suddenly the bumping, which was considerable because it is only grass, ceased. And there we were, poised in the air. We just left the ground. Most wonderful sensation it was, because here all was still and calm, except for the roar of the engine with that propeller in front of us.
While Philip continued his training with the Naval Air Squadron, Gerald Dixon joined the Royal Flying Corps.
I never thought I would ever be able to fly it by myself. I called but he said, "Oh yes, you will, Dixon." And then the day came, and I think everybody who's flown solo in their lives will never forget that experience. And when he said to me, "Dixon, now off you go," I looked at the aeroplane, and I looked at him, and I thought, now, if I say I'm not qualified, I don't feel I could fly it, he might ground me and send me off to the army, which I didn't want to do. It's the last thing I wanted to do. So I got into the aeroplane, and somehow or other kept it in the air for half an hour and landed it safely. When I landed, I hoped that he would come, pat me on the back and say, "Well done, Dixon," but he'd gone to lunch.
The war was drawing to a close, but there was still time for both Philip and Gerald to go operational.
I was detailed to go on an operational station, a seaplane station at Westgate-on-Sea, near Margate, at the extreme end of Kent. This is the nearest part of our operations, I suppose, to the enemy, who were not so very far away across that corner of the North Sea in Belgium. But the function there was to patrol that lower part of the North Sea, as Thames approaches, and the Straits of Dover, to carry a bomb sufficiently big and lethal to destroy a submarine, and to have sufficient ammunition and machine guns for the observer to use if we were attacked by an enemy aircraft. We also carried a couple of pigeons with us, which the observer had in the cockpit, in case we came down and were out of touch with base and could send a message back. This happened to me when the engine suddenly started to cough and choke and stop, and I had to make an emergency forced landing and get the aircraft down safely onto the water. I was spotted by a trawler and was approached and eventually taken in tow, and I think I was towed into Margate.
I did have one accident. Up to that time, I'd felt that I wouldn't have accidents. I was doing photographs, and the wind got up, and I had no idea how to get down. I was about 4,000 feet. Fortunately, I managed to get down to about the height of this house when I was blown over back and landed upside down. The petrol tank broke and I bruised my arm, but otherwise I was all right. But the instructor never told me what I'd done wrong or anything like that. We learnt more by talking among ourselves than by any instruction. Some people could take it, most people could take it, I think. Sometimes the Germans had better aeroplanes, sometimes we had better aeroplanes. And I would like to pay a tribute to those wonderful people who fought in those aeroplanes. I think they're the bravest of the brave.
By early 1918, it was becoming obvious that two separate air forces were cumbersome and inefficient.
Here were these two very large, vital units developing, one with army traditions and uniform, and ours with naval traditions and uniform. On the 1st of April, the Royal Flying Corps and the Royal Naval Air Service were merged together to form the Royal Air Force.
I was very determined to become a good pilot. And I think by the armistice, I'd had more hours in than the average people by that time. I taught myself a lot what to do and what not to do. And I love my DH-9, I must say.
Next week in Wings, ordinary people take to the air in passenger-carrying aeroplanes. And on Southampton water, a seaplane becomes the fastest aeroplane in the world.
All 7 episodes.